Hi, and welcome to Violence in the Workplace Safety Training. Every worker has the right to a safe and healthy work environment, but unfortunately, violence can happen in the workplace. With proper training and awareness, you can help prevent violent incidents from occurring at your workplace.
Whether it be verbal abuse, a threat, or an act of physical assault, the frequency of violent acts in the workplace is growing every year. This type of occupational violence is a very real threat that can impact any worker at any time. In fact, nearly 2 million American workers per year report being the victims of workplace violence. In this training course, we will talk about the most common types of violence that employees might experience while on the job, and some of the warning signs to look out for. We will also discuss some of the ways that employers and workers can help prevent violence from occurring at their places of work. Please discuss the following information with your supervisor if you have any questions about the content of this training module. By the end of this training session, you should be able to recognize violence when it is happening in your place of work, identify warning signs of violent behavior, and know the correct response to these signs. Know the proper precautions to take in order to help prevent workplace violence. Understand the appropriate way to respond when a violent incident is happening in your workplace. And know what should occur after a violent incident happens at your place of work. Workplace violence can be an act of physical aggression, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening or disruptive behavior that occurs at a workplace. Anytime a person is attempting to harm someone physically or mentally in a work setting could be classified as violence. This can range from threats and verbal abuse all the way to physical assaults and even homicide. And while many acts of physical violence do occur between two or more coworkers, violence in the workplace does not only apply to conflicts between two employees. It can affect and involve employees, clients, customers, visitors, and even bystanders of a business. While many jobs across the country present a variety of potentially dangerous work hazards, violence is one that is commonly overlooked by employees. But in fact, acts of violence is currently the third leading cause of all fatal occupational injuries in the United States. OSHA even estimates that around 2 million workers are affected by on-the-job violence every year, with more than 20,000 of those workers needing to miss multiple days of work due to injuries. Although workplace violence can happen to any employee in any industry, certain workers are at an increased risk of experiencing violent assaults. Some of the factors that could potentially increase a worker's risk include jobs that include frequent contact with the public, jobs that include the exchange of money, delivering goods and services to houses or businesses, mobile workspaces such as taxis, police cars, or buses, working with unstable or volatile persons in healthcare, social services, or criminal justice settings, working alone, late at night, or early in the morning, guarding valuable property or possessions, or working in high crime areas. Some of the individual jobs that experience a higher rate of violence than others include healthcare and social service workers, such as nurses, counselors, and probation officers, community employees, such as utility workers, home service installers, and construction men and women, and face-to-face service jobs such as letter carriers, retail employees, and taxi drivers. It is still important, however, to remember that workplace violence can strike anywhere in any industry. The reality is that violence in the workplace is becoming increasingly common, and because of this, all workers should know what to look for in order to prevent, stop, and manage an act of violence in their place of work. The first step in helping to manage workplace violence is to understand how it can happen. Most incidents involving workplace violence can be broken down into 4 categories. These categories identify the 4 groups of perpetrators that most commonly inflict violence at places of business. The 4 types are: Type 1, perpetrators with criminal intent. Type 2, customers of businesses. Type 3, worker-on-worker conflicts. And Type 4, violence stemming from personal relationships. Perpetrators of Type 1 workplace violence, criminal intent, usually have no direct involvement with the company or its employees. This type of violence almost always occurs due to an additional crime being committed at the job site, such as a robbery or shoplifting. The violence enacted during criminal intent situations is usually physical and extremely dangerous. Criminals attempting a robbery are often armed with deadly weapons and can use extreme force to injure or even kill employees in order to get away with their crime. In fact, the majority of all occupational deaths due to workplace violence falls into the category of criminal intent. Customers are the second culprit of workplace violence and include any person that a company provides services for. This can be the typical shopper in a store, but also extends to clients of nonprofit businesses. For example, students in a school, patients of a hospital, or even inmates in a prison can fall into this category. Customers make up the majority of all non-fatal violent workplace events in America. Incidents with customers usually involve intense verbal assault, harassment, and intimidation. This is often the result of the customer having problems with a product or service, being refused services by the company, or feeling as though they have been treated unfairly. The third type of violent perpetrators are employees themselves. Worker-on-worker violence involves either a current or former employee of a business inflicting violence onto another current or former employee of that same business. Acts of violence in this type are almost always less random or spontaneous than those involving criminals or customers. Worker-on-worker violence often builds slowly over time, with problems between coworkers continuing to escalate until they reach the point of violence. Many acts of violence in this category are limited to intense acts of verbal assault or hostile work behavior, but they can and do build to acts of physical violence as well. The fourth and final type of workplace violence involves perpetrators who have no relationship to the business, but instead have a close personal relationship with an employee of that business. Perpetrators of this type are usually a spouse or partner, former spouse or former partner, a relative, or a friend. Violence involving personal relationships almost always focuses on issues that take place outside of the workplace. Domestic violence between partners is the leading cause of this violence, with women being at much higher risk of becoming victims than men. In fact, over 25% of all violent events in the workplace involve some sort of domestic violence.
Now that we've gone over the basics of workplace violence, it's important to understand how you can prevent it from happening in your workplace. Let's take a look at how businesses and employees work together to stop this violence from ever happening.
While it is not possible to guarantee that violence will never occur at your place of work, there are steps that can be taken to minimize the chances and create a safer environment for everyone. For example, both employers and employees should know the warning signs to look out for in potential violent perpetrators. Employees should document and report each case of intimidation, harassment, or verbal assault that they observe while at work. Employers should provide safe education for workers so that they know what contact is acceptable and how to respond to it. And additionally, have a written zero-tolerance policy towards workplace violence and implement a violence prevention program. Knowing some of the warning signs to look out for in a potentially violent employee is one of the most effective ways to prevent workplace violence. It is important that both employers and employees be able to recognize these signs in their coworkers. These signs could include workers who appear visibly upset over events in their lives, such as a personal crisis, show signs of mental instability, perceive themselves as being treated unfairly, or blame others for their problems, are known to be abusing drugs and or alcohol, appear moody or withdrawn from their coworkers, bring weapons into work or in their vehicle, talk about their wishes to hurt themselves or others, or show an inability to control their emotions, such as loud outbursts, swearing, or slamming doors. It is important to note that just because someone displays the warning signs of violent behavior does not automatically mean that they will become a violent person. Sometimes coworkers just have a bad day, or their behaviors could be misinterpreted. But a continuous pattern of troubling behaviors, or a recent growth of increasingly troubling behaviors, could be a clear warning sign that an intervention needs to occur. Because of this, it is crucial that workers document and report any type of violent behavior that they see in their coworkers, however big or small. Oftentimes, smaller acts of aggression or violence, such as a verbal outburst or threat, can lead to significantly larger acts of violence in the future. Having clear documentation of each of these outbursts can help show a pattern of behavior and potentially lead to stopping the violence before it happens. Violence prevention programs are a dedicated set of plans implemented by businesses that are used to help deter acts of violence from happening in the workplace. These programs include a combination of administrative controls and employee training that work together to keep employees safe. OSHA's 5 major elements of an effective workplace violence prevention program are management commitment and employee involvement, worksite analysis, hazard prevention and control, safety and health training, and record keeping and program evaluation. Each element of a violence prevention program can be used in different ways depending on the type of perpetrator. We will start by looking at ways to prevent workplace violence caused by criminal intent. Because most of the violent acts in the criminal intent category center around theft, shoplifting, and robberies, prevention methods for this type focus on administrative changes that can make the workplace safer. Some of those include limiting the amount of cash on hand, installing surveillance cameras or hiring security guards, controlling the business's operating hours, limiting all entrances and exits into the business, having multiple employees on duty at all times, and training employees on appropriate robbery response. Violent acts involving customers almost always begin due to the customers who are angry or emotional over an issue with the business. Low responsiveness or a bad quality of service from employees can lead to frustration and agitation in these customers, clients, or patients. Prevention methods for this category focus on maintaining a staff that includes a good mixture of skill sets and personalities. Hiring a diverse staff can increase the odds of having someone present who can reach the customer and potentially de-escalate the situation. Workers should always be trained in the areas of recognizing behavioral cues that precede violence, interpersonal communication skills, violence de-escalation techniques, and proper restraint and takedown techniques for healthcare and law enforcement staff. When it comes to preventing worker-on-worker violence, good hiring practices are the key. Because this type of violence only involves employees of the company, violent acts can be eliminated by only bringing in workers who are unlikely to participate in violent acts. When evaluating potential employees, employers should make sure to conduct criminal background checks and verify all references. Training employees to properly report any signs of violent behavior and their coworkers can also go a long way towards preventing worker-on-worker violence. All new employees should be informed of the proper channels to take to report signs of harassment, intimidation, or physical acts of violence that they see on the job. To prevent the violence that occurs due to personal relationships, company policies and procedures must provide workers with clear-cut information about the nature of personal relationship violence, its observable traits, and warning signs for noticing it in coworkers. Employers must train workers on what to do if they suspect that a coworker is involved in interpersonal violence, either as a victim or perpetrator. A company should also strive to create a culture of support for victims. This includes assurances that no penalties exist for coming forward, complete confidentiality will be observed, and safety and security protocols will be implemented. Companies should also inform all workers about the consequences of being a perpetrator of interpersonal violence or any other form of workplace violence. The company should communicate clearly through policies and training that they have a zero-tolerance policy for violent behavior and that perpetrators will be dealt with.
While we can work together to help prevent violence from happening, the reality is violent acts can and do still happen. We will now take a look at some of the ways workers like you should respond when confronted with real-life violent situations.
It is first important that employees understand to take all acts of workplace violence seriously. Any violent action or act of aggression has the potential to escalate into a much larger and more serious confrontation. Always treat even the smallest acts of violence seriously and respond appropriately. When responding to acts of violence in your workplace, start by securing your own personal safety before anything else. Always remain calm. Never attempt to argue or respond to threats. Avoid any behavior that might increase the person's anger or intensify the problem. As soon as possible, contact your supervisor so that they can attempt to de-escalate the situation. And in situations that present an immediate danger to your personal safety, leave the area immediately and call 911 if possible. Some acts of violence are more severe and dangerous than others. In these scenarios, more intensive and specialized responses are required by employees. In the event of an active shooter arise at your place of work, you should immediately focus on preserving your own life. To do this, first run. Plan ahead and have an escape route in mind. Leave all of your belongings behind and escape the area as quickly as possible. Next, hide. If unable to completely exit the property, hide in an area out of sight of the shooter's view. Lock any doors and block any entries to your hiding place. Silence your cell phone and remain quiet until help arrives. And finally, fight. This option should only ever be used as a last resort when your life is in immediate danger. Attempt to incapacitate the shooter and act with as much physical aggression as possible. Use any available items nearby as makeshift weapons. Additionally, it is important to note that more thorough, dedicated active shooter safety courses are available for employees in workplaces that are at a high risk of gun violence. Following any act of violence in the workplace, there are several steps that employers must take to properly manage the situation. These actions can reassure workers and make them feel safe while continuing their job. It is important that employers are swift and decisive in their actions in order to reaffirm the company's zero-tolerance policy towards violence. Some of the things employers can do include issuing disciplinary action towards any employee that participated or encouraged workplace violence. This action can include termination of their position. Continuing to encourage employees to report and log all incidents of threats, harassment, and violence on the job. Informing the victims of violence about their rights to prosecute perpetrators for their actions. and discussing the circumstances of all violent incidents and threats with the staff in order to improve the safety of the workplace. Thanks for paying attention. With an awareness of how workplace violence can happen, and the knowledge of how to prevent and manage the situation when it does, you are now prepared to help keep your worksite a safer place. Here are some of the key points to remember in order to better handle violent situations in the workplace. Workplace violence can come from any different perpetrators, including criminals, customers, coworkers, and personal relationships. Being aware of the warning signs that lead to workplace violence will help you prevent it from happening. Always document every instance of workplace violence that you observe and report it to your supervisor. And finally, when dealing with a violent perpetrator, remain calm, prioritize your safety, and never escalate the situation.